Holly, welcome to Trucking Genius.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us today. We've dedicated this program to trying to figure out the trucking industry and driver recruiting in particular. So understanding your background and understanding what we're working on together, the importance of ad spend. It's a big part of driver recruiting today. And knowing that you've come in from outside of trucking into this industry, can you talk to me a little bit about your experience externally and how you've navigated through the trucking industry over the last couple of months?
Yeah, so I came from a very different industry. Started my career in agency, so I understand how to manage these channels, but I also came from a very automated place. I think one of the biggest differences is in trucking, I feel the automation potentially is lacking, but I think also because the human component is so important. So I think that's what I've learned most of.
So how do you think you still believe in automation, obviously,
100%.
and understanding what you're doing, but this element of the recruiter being in that place to move candidates and applicants from one stage to the other, how have you incorporated that into how you approach ad spend?
So I think for me, it's like a efficiency lever, right? So when you have a funnel, you acquire the lead, they come through, and then they progress through that funnel. Within trucking, the recruiter is the funnel, right? So you're speaking with the driver, you're moving them from stage to stage. So really, the recruiter is one of the main reasons of why your cost per hire is the way it is, right? You can do so much at the top of the funnel to optimize and be as efficient as you can, but your full app to hire ratio is going to impact what your cost per hire is, essentially efficiency. So the recruiter in this instance is so important because that could change you from having a $1,000 cost per hire to a $200 cost per hire, which is very different.
What other metrics, you mentioned cost per hire, what other metrics have you looked at in the past and do you look at today? What are you focused on when you talk about spend?
So I think cost per hire is still the most important, but as we all know, like that path to conversion can take some time, right? So it can be from 7 days to 30 days. I think some carriers that I've spoken to is like 90 days. So you really need an upper funnel metric to really track success, right? So I look at cost per lead and cost per full application. So when we talk about a lead, that's basic information. So first and last name, potentially what CDL you have, years of experience. The full application is basically all the information that you need to process that driver into the funnel. So for them, you really need to know a proxy metric to be able to understand what your cost per hire will be.
When I think about budgets, and we have a fairly large budget, as do other carriers, there's a ton of money spent in the industry on job posts and ad spend. There's also many different options, places to spend that money. How do you think about taking your full budget and optimizing that spend, making sure that you're getting the most out of what you're investing in?
I think for me, it's all about efficiency. And I think that starts with being able to track where your applications come from. So essentially, if you're spending with Indeed and a ZipRecruiter, those channels are going to perform differently. But unless you track where those applicants are coming from, you don't really know. So I think the first layer is tracking applicant flow, reporting on it, and then figuring out as a business what works for you. So for some companies, it may be having a big spread, right, across multiple channels. And when I say channel, I mean like an Indeed, a Zip, a Monster, a Google. For other companies where you maybe don't have as much budget, you really want to focus on the ones that are most efficient for you. And when you were talking before about cost per lead, cost per full application, that's the efficiency. So it could be on Indeed that you drive a cost per full app at $15. And on Zip, it's 25. Well, if I have less budget, I'm going to focus on Indeed. I don't want to spread yourself too thin.
What about non-cost tactics that we rely on the field to execute, the recruiters, the carrier managers, things like that? How do you incorporate that into your optimization? Are you able to track certain things that they do as recruiters that you aren't able to capture from a spend perspective?
So in the sense of like email blast, lifecycle communication?
Text. We have a database of drivers that are ongoing that we can reach out to. Do you try to understand the impact of those tactics to incorporate that into your decision making?
100%. So for me, that's the first point, right? So when you're thinking about where to spend, the first thing you should be looking at is your pipeline. So if I have a position in Miami, Florida, and I have 20 applications in my pipeline, I do not want to spend money there first, right? I want to be focusing on my free tactics, so my email blasts, my lifecycle communications, to see if we can get everybody through. Then if we don't have the pipeline, that's when you start to spend that money.
Gotcha. How do things change daily, weekly, monthly? How do you think about that? Do you monitor closely, or is it something that you just put into place and next month take a look at it and see what happens?
You know what? So when I worked in other industries, like in the travel sector, it was kind of not a set and forget, but you would have a monthly budget and you would work to goals. This industry changes every single day. So some days you will have 10 jobs in one location. If you have good recruiters, some of those jobs will close. So it's how do you adapt that spend very quickly? So one of the biggest things for us is we have our reports, our data that will tell us where we have jobs. The next piece is the feedback loop, right, from the recruitment team. So, myself and the director of recruiting are in constant communication on essentially where we should spend that budget. So for me, I see it as a day by day piece, but you don't want to change every day. You want to keep an eye on things every day and maybe change once or twice a week, not to re-trigger learning phases and stuff like that.
Got it. Were you surprised coming in at the budgets, the amount of money that carriers spend, especially the larger carriers, and not understanding attribution? That's something in the industry that I think is needed, but I don't think we're all there yet.
100%. It makes me feel a little bit nervous that we can spend so much money and not essentially be able to track end-to-end funnel. But I understand why, because it's tricky to be able to do that. You need the teams who are managing the budget to be fully set up. You need to be able to capture the referrer. We use 10 Street, so it's a lot easier for us, but other kind of ATSs, they may have very different tracking setups. So that makes a lot of sense. But yes, it's one of the core foundations to spending money. That's a universal piece that you need to have in place.
We are lucky because we have scale and we have budget. How do you think a smaller carrier or mid-sized carrier with not a lot of resources or time to get through this, to start to understand impact of what's working, what's not working, without the ability to track and to see attribution? They've maybe got budget to spend on Indeed only or Craigslist only. How do you start to make inroads in understanding what's working, what's not working?
I think what you have to do is you need to get a baseline. So rather than start with multiple things, start with one thing, right? So you said Craigslist or Indeed, just pick one and just see how that works, knowing that the additional incremental leads that are coming through are likely from that activity. And then you can see how they perform. And then you can start to layer on additional channels. Obviously, when you have more than 2 or 3 channels, it's going to be really tricky to know what delivered what. So that's when you really need to put the tracking in place. But at least at the start, you can use one channel to see differences.
The other thing I think about, if you do have limited budget and limited resources, if you're going to use one platform, for example, Indeed or Craigslist or Zip or Appcast, really understand all of the functionality and tools that you have available within that platform. So you're not only optimizing your spend, but you're optimizing your commitment to Indeed. They have many different options, tools, and it's not just here's my budget and okay, we'll check in on you next month. It's really understanding all that you can do within Indeed, within ZipRecruiter or Craigslist, whatever you choose your platform to be, to spend time in that place and really understand all that you can do within. I think you've done a good job and with your team in doing that.
And I think so. From my experience has always been we're talking about ad spend right now. There are other tools that you can pay for that actually may be more efficient if you're a smaller company. We've started it, right? The reverse search on Indeed. So Indeed Resume. You pay a monthly fee for that, but that could be a huge acquisition tool for you, right? And it's way more, it's cheaper. It's a lot cheaper. So I think, yes, understanding, like you said, what the channel has to offer. And maybe if you don't have as much budget, maybe that style of, quote unquote, ad spend would be the best fit.
When you think about cost per hire, cost per application, should the industry benchmark be? What should the expectation be? Because I'm sure carriers are out there And it's not an easy thing to do to get a cost per hire, right? Or a cost per app or a cost per partial app. What metrics should they look at? Should they start tracking it and just look at that metric as a baseline and see if they can improve on it? Because it's very hard to say your cost per application should be $200 or $20.
There's so many factors that go into what a good cost per application is. And I think we've really struggled with this, right? So I know that when I joined, there was a baseline of like $20 is a good cost per application. But then when you take into factors of where is the job, right? Is it in a metro area versus a rural area? What are the components of the job? So do you require hazmat? Like, do they need a TWIC card? Like, all of those things differ that will decide how difficult it is to hire for that position. And essentially that is your baseline, okay? So I think for me, you should have an average of what you're trying to achieve because you need to be profitable at the end of the day. But it's not a one size fits all. So one job versus another may cost you a lot more to acquire for. But that's probably because there's less people or less drivers in market that can do that job. And that's okay. I think the important thing is for the more efficient jobs. So the jobs that could be more efficient, let's say. So maybe it's the metro areas with less experience, CDLA, no other endorsements. Try and be more efficient on those, right? To average it out.
I think that's an interesting point that you brought through, that it's driven by the market itself, the job itself, and the difficulty in getting applications to that job. That's an important data set to inform us or other recruiting teams whether or not to go out and fill an open position, take a lane, take the contract, because I don't think there's a lot of thought put into the idea that I have an open seat. And we know based on experience that it's going to cost me at least X to fill that seat, and then make financial decisions and business decisions based off that. So if I'm going to take this contract in Atlanta, for example, I'm going to need to get drivers in Atlanta to do that run. It's a local run, you're home daily, but I can only pay you $18 an hour. So that's going to cost me more to find that driver. So it may make a lot of sense when you don't consider the recruiting costs or the marketing costs, but when you factor that in, that cost, it may be prohibitive. But I don't think a lot of people or carriers understand that or take that into consideration. It's more of a given and say, oh, it's going to be expensive, it's going to be time consuming, but we've been able to fill it in the past, so we should be able to fill it now. I think having that information that you're starting to dig into and bring together is powerful, and something that we're going to leverage within Transforce and help our carriers do so as well.
Right. And I think you mentioned pay as one element. I know it's a really important component, right? Pay, but there are other things that I think you can do within a job description to make it more appealing, right? So there are so many benefits. I saw the other day that there was a job out there and it was like pet friendly. So you could take your pet to someone. That's a huge perk. Myself, if I was a driver. So I think there are things that you can pull to the top of your job descriptions when you don't think you're that competitive. The smallest things can be benefits.
Can you talk a little bit about tweaking the job post and the job description and how that helps with spend?
Sure. So my personal opinion is to be as transparent as possible in job descriptions. And reason being is you can spend a lot of money if you're vague, right? So if you can get a lot of clicks and a lot of applies, but when you actually really sell that role to the driver, it may not be a good fit. And you've just wasted all that money up front. So at the end of the day, what I try and do is be as transparent as you can in the job description. Requirements need to be quite high on the job. You will get less volume, but you're going to get more quality applications. And that's really the aim of the game, right? It's great to have 40 applicants, but if only 3 of them have the expectation of that job, then can you fill it? I don't know. So I think for me, it's all about being as transparent in the job as possible, and structuring it in a way that isn't fluffy. I see a lot of jobs that are huge chunks of text, when realistically it's the key points you need to be pulling out, and no more than, I think, 400 words.
We've talked about that in previous episodes, that you can put things in the bottom of the job description that the drivers will never read. And you just test that and say, but they're not going to scroll down and read all of that. So make sure you get the high points in that first paragraph or that first block of content. So talking more about the job description and what you can do with a job post. One of the things that I think about day over day, week over week, when we have a new position in a market, there's a lot of fresh eyes on that job. So your conversion or your number of applications coming through is going to be higher. The next week, there's not going to be as many fresh eyes. It's not going to be a fresh opportunity. What do you do to continue to drive applicants to that dated job or a job that's been in market for a couple of weeks?
For me, I think it's looking at the job description in more detail and seeing if there's any optimizations that you can do there, right? So you could have had the same title for a couple of weeks, like change it up. Let's see, maybe pull pay in there. Maybe if there's a sign-on bonus, pull that in there. I know you call it the hook, and I have to do that hand signal when you talk about it because that's how I see it. But it's pulling in the important pieces right to the top and changing it up. I would say that's probably one of the biggest things you can do. And then understand when the drop-off was, right? To understand, did something in the market change?
Right. Yeah, because there's always those instances. I remember the last time we were here in Florida, two of the trucking companies in this market had stopped operating. So there's a whole pool of drivers there who came available, who will be looking for opportunities to be able to capitalize on those if we had other jobs available.
Right.
So it's understanding what's in the market as well.
I think as well, Craig, like we've spoken about this in depth, it's understanding your competition too, right? And it's very easy to do that, to go to Indeed or Craigslist and do a search to see how does your pay compare? What other benefits do you have? And then you can start to see how competitive you are. I think competitive insights are really difficult to find. Like we were talking before about what's the perfect cost per hire.
Right.
There's so many components that go into that, which make it very difficult. So, having a bit more of a knowledge of that market, it doesn't have to be tricky. It doesn't have to be full of data. Just going to these platforms and say, do I bench in the 50th percentile or am I way below? And you can get a gauge on that.
But what if you're in a situation, Holly, where your job's not competitive in the market? You've got a budget. You're required to drive applicants to that job, knowing full well that it's not the most attractive job in the market. How do you approach something like that?
That's a really difficult one. And I think what you have to do is maybe you pull out some of the things in the job. Like, I don't like to do that, but if you really need to fill the job, maybe you make it a little more vague, but you have to have really strong recruiters to back it up, right? So you have to have recruiters that understand the job, know the additional benefits, like the soft benefits, right? The things that will add together to make it a more appealing job. And then lean on your recruitment team to be able to sell that. Now, probably will be a higher cost per hire. And I think you just need to take that. And as I mentioned before, if you can offset where it's easier to recruit and make that more efficient, your net is going to be fine.
What about the idea that, okay, it's a competitive market. My job is not as competitive as I want it to be. I've got to drive applicants. Do you look at your other platforms? So Monster, we may not have been using it in the past, or Indeed or the others. Try it over here and see if you do get any impact, or if your job is more competitive where others are not posting,
you have
for example.
And I think that's not something just that we do when you have a tricky job. I think that's something you're doing on a weekly basis, right? The markets change. You need to understand what market is what channel, is efficient for you at that time in the seasonal peaks. So yes, I would say so.
And we talked about using a channel and everybody being on the same channel and competing there. And at the end of the day, you're just pouring money into where everybody else is pouring money into as well. So understanding that threshold, those diminishing returns by channel as well, to be able to move from one to another and optimize through that.
Yeah, so I actually did some searches today to see on Indeed how many jobs come up when you type in CDLA driver, Miami. There's over 800 jobs.
Right.
So, and you really need to be on the first page, right, to be competitive.
Absolutely.
So I think it's all about understanding where the demand is, so where the drivers are searching. There's so many different job boards that you can test, and seeing where you can be competitive. And with a small budget, it makes sense to be solely focused on Indeed. That is the biggest player in the market. When you start to grow that budget, you need to diversify because you need to go where you're going to be the most efficient. Our setup today is, I would say, complex. I think we've got it to a really good position where we spend across maybe 50, 60 different job boards, and we're allowing the data signals to come back to us to tell us this is actually working for you. Move more budget here. And this one isn't working so much. So pull budget out. And we're using human experience, I would say, from our team, tech, and also the recruitment team to help us decide where we're spending. So I feel like our setup today is really strong.
So our setup today, you would agree, is centralized, right? I think it's important to understand your organization and figure out what's the optimal structure. We've gravitated to this because we think it works for us. Some number of these national carriers, large carriers, have different branches in different locations, and they're very isolated. They're very specific to their market. So you would assume that they know their market very well and should operate in a vacuum in that market. There are benefits to both. We've moved in the direction of centralization. What do you see as the benefits of doing that for larger carriers?
Right. So I'm a big fan of centralization. The reason being is we've talked about it already. Things change so frequently. So if you give a set budget to a certain market and they do a great job and they close 50% of their orders, what happens to that budget? Right? If it's with a central team and there's a feedback loop with recruitment, we can basically work together to move that budget where it needs to go. So for me personally, having one central team managing the budgets, you get no surprises at the end of the month, right? So there will be instances where, say, for example, you have 20 branches, someone underspends, someone overspends. Who is taking account for all that budget? You could have a very nasty surprise at the end of the month. So having that in one team, the piece that we need to make sure that happens, and we've worked really hard on this, is the feedback loop from recruitment. So they're helping us on a twice a week, basis to understand, okay, you were spending here, now we need to switch it. This is what we're seeing from the field. And the other thing is being able to forecast, right? So the recruitment team have worked in the industry for so many years. They know the peaks and the troughs. So they know, hey, we're going to expect an order in the next couple of weeks. We need to be ready. And so we can get ahead of the game versus being reactive.
You've been in the trucking industry now for 6 months.
It feels like 10 years.
Yeah.
10 months. I'm coming up to my year.
Okay. What's next as far as, where do you see improvements? Where do you see being able to continue to optimize spend? Are there technologies that are in the pipeline? What should we be thinking about to get ahead of it and talking to our fellow recruiters about?
So I think being in the ad space for the last 10 years, trends that aren't just specific to trucking, it will get more expensive year over year. And it always does as more advertisers enter the marketplace. So I think one of the big takeaways for me is efficiency. So companies that can understand their flows, understand what their cost per hire is, even though it may be very difficult, these guys are going to win because they'll be able to optimize and understand where they need to be. So, for example, I foresee that some of these job boards will make it a little bit more tricky to get organic share. I think they will start to put in place caps on spend per job. So you'll need to be also very tactical on the jobs you decide to sponsor, right? Because we only have so much budget. So it may be you wanted to sponsor 100 jobs. I would say by next year, you may have to be more tactical and put more spend on a select number of jobs.
When I think about costs increasing, it's going to happen. When I think about the positions we try to fill in the markets that we're in, we're competing, right? It's a competition with other carriers. We're all competing for the same driver. Knowing that costs will increase, that things will continue to be more difficult, the carriers that focus more on the efficiency and optimizing their driver marketing budget, they're going to win, to your point. And they're going to be here at the end of the day. So it really is a testament to the idea that you should focus and should understand the impact of your spend and always continue to optimize it and make sure that you're spending in the right places, for sure.
And I think as well, as a secondary point, that driver coming in as a new lead, we know that drivers tend to churn, right? Every year. The experience they have with you that first time will basically dictate their feelings about you. So if you can have that good experience and that driver potentially wants a new job, potentially they will stay within the company family, right? And I think that's really important as well, is treating drivers with respect when they come through the flow, no bait and switch. And I think that's going to help as well, because then you don't have to go out and pay for additional leads. If you have a good retention base, maybe you can reduce your marketing costs or keep them flat because you know you've got a strong pipeline and you have good retention with your drivers.
No, that's come through in all of the episodes that we've done to this point. Making sure that you take care of your drivers, you're not misrepresenting anything, you have their best interest at heart, and it'll pay dividends, maybe not in the near term, but in the future.
100%.
For sure. We're at time, Holly.
Fantastic.
So thank you very much for joining today. We will definitely get you back and pick your brain, but I think that went well.
Thank you for having me.